Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. If you've been anywhere near education, corporate training, or honestly, even just an app store lately, you have definitely seen microlearning in action. But today, we're going beyond the hype. We're going to look at the rigorous PhD research of Nidhi Sachdeva to figure out how to shift microlearning from just a trendy corporate buzzword into a highly structured, evidence-based tool that's actually optimized for the human brain. So how do we make these short bursts of learning actually stick? Let's find out.
And to prevent taxing your working memory right off the bat, here's our roadmap for today. We'll hit 1. The microlearning buzzword. 2. How the brain learns. 3. Understanding cognitive load. 4. The explicit instruction solution. And finally, 5. Building better micro-lessons.
All right, Section 1, the microlearning buzzword. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room, the massive hype surrounding short-form content, and why, quite frankly, brevity alone just isn't enough for formal learning.
You know, everyone kind of thinks they know exactly what microlearning is, right? It's a YouTube short, a TikTok tutorial, or maybe just a quick graphic on LinkedIn. But as our source points out, without a solid grounding in cognitive science, it's really just an empty trend. The massive marketing appeal of things being short and sweet has unfortunately allowed a lot of designers to just completely ignore the fact that microlearning often lacks any universally accepted theoretical foundation.
Which brings us to a really crucial tension. Think about it. If we're designing content in these little bite-sized chunks without actually understanding how the brain processes information, we are completely destined to fail. Just making something short doesn't magically make it educational. Sure, it might fit perfectly into our super busy schedules, but if it doesn't actually result in a change in our long-term memory, well, then it isn't actually learning at all.
So, moving to Section 2, how the brain learns. To answer that big question of why short learning so often fails, and more importantly, how we fix it, we need to look at David Geary's fascinating evolutionary theory of learning. Get ready because this is a real paradigm shift.
Check out this distinction between skills we evolve to learn automatically versus cultural knowledge that requires intense, conscious effort. Geary basically categorizes learning into two distinct buckets. First, you have biologically primary knowledge. This includes things like walking, recognizing faces, or learning to speak your native language. We are literally genetically hardwired for this stuff. It's effortless and requires almost zero explicit instruction. But then you have biologically secondary knowledge, like reading, solving complex math problems, or figuring out a new software platform. This is completely different. We didn't evolve to do this automatically. It requires massive conscious effort and, crucially, explicit instruction. Educational microlearning lives entirely in this secondary space. We absolutely cannot just expect learners to naturally absorb it.
And this brilliantly illustrates our ultimate biological bottleneck. If you look at the flow here, information from our environment comes in as sensory input, but, and this is a huge but, it has to pass through our severely limited short-term or working memory before it can ever become stable, long-term learning. All the way back in the 1950s, cognitive psychologist George Miller discovered that our working memory can only hold about 7 items, give or take a couple, at any given time. This bottleneck literally dictates exactly how fast and how effectively we can acquire new knowledge.
That brings us to Section 3, understanding cognitive load. Because that working memory bottleneck is just so tight, we absolutely have to talk about cognitive load theory, and really, the main villain of our story here, cognitive overload. Here's the crucial point. If you overload a learner's working memory with confusing designs, messy fonts, or honestly just dumping too much data on them at once, absolutely zero long-term learning takes place. The working memory just gets clogged. It desperately wants to build what we call schemas, which, think of them as basically mental folders that organize information so we can easily retrieve it later. But if the cognitive bandwidth is maxed out, those schemas never get built. The learning simply evaporates. Poof, gone.
Sweller's cognitive load theory breaks this down beautifully into 3 types of load. First, we have intrinsic load. That's just the inherent difficulty of the subject matter itself. Like, learning calculus obviously has a higher intrinsic load than learning to tie your shoes, right? Then we have germane load, which is actually a good thing. That's the mental effort specifically used to build those mental folders, those schemas we just talked about. But smack in the middle, we have extraneous load. This is the villain. Extraneous load comes entirely from poorly designed instruction, distracting graphics, unclear speech, convoluted navigation, you name it. High extraneous load literally robs the brain of the energy it needs for that good germane processing. So our primary goal as educators and designers absolutely must be to aggressively eliminate that harmful extraneous load. All right, Section 4, the explicit instruction solution. If extraneous load is the villain clogging up our working memory, then explicit instructional guidance is absolutely, without a doubt, our hero.
There is this huge myth in education that learners should just figure things out on their own. You hear it called discovery learning or minimally guided instruction. But wait, remember Geary's theory? We are dealing with biologically secondary knowledge here. For novices who completely lack those background schemas, unguided discovery causes massive cognitive friction. It is so frustrating and incredibly inefficient. Explicit instructional guidance, on the other hand, completely lowers that barrier. By directly providing the missing pieces and fully explaining the core concepts up front, we drastically reduce that nasty extraneous load.
And decades of research back up this explicit approach. It's beautifully captured right here in Barak Rosenshine's 17 Principles of Effective Instruction. Rosenshine looked at cognitive science, the actual classroom practices of master teachers, and cognitive scaffolding, and you know what? He found they all pointed to the exact same strategies. Things like presenting new material in small steps, providing clear models, constantly checking for understanding, and really guiding student practice.
Now, to keep your own working memory from totally overloading by trying to memorize all 17 of those right now, here are the absolute core principles you must apply when crafting micro-lessons for novice learners. First, begin with a short review to activate prior knowledge. Second, present new material in small steps, which is literally the very definition of good microlearning. Third, provide models and worked-out problems so learners aren't just sitting there guessing. And finally, carefully guide student practice. These aren't just good ideas, folks. They are cognitive lifelines for your learners.
Which brings us to our final stop, Section 5, Building Better Microlessons. Let's bring all this amazing cognitive science together and look at how we actually practically build a highly effective microlesson using the right multimedia tools.
When we start applying all this to visual slides, short videos, or interactive infographics, we lean heavily on the research of Richard Mayer. His cognitive theory of multimedia learning is basically the gold standard in the industry, precisely because it's built entirely on how our brain actually works. He bases his theory on 3 foundational structural assumptions about our cognitive architecture. Let's break them down. First up, we have dual channels. This is rooted in Alan Pavio's dual coding theory. And it basically means our brain has one specific, dedicated channel for processing what we see, like pictures, cool animations, and text, and a completely separate channel for processing what we hear, like spoken narration. We learn so much better when we use both of these systems together in a complementary way, rather than just relying on one or the other. Second, and this is key, despite having these wonderful dual channels, each one still has a strictly limited capacity. This loops us right back around to the dangers of cognitive overload we were talking about earlier. If you cram way too many graphics onto a single screen, the visual channel just crashes. If you have overlapping audio tracks or totally chaotic voiceover, the auditory channel crashes. You absolutely have to balance the load across both channels. Finally, active processing dictates that learning just isn't a passive activity where we can just sit back on the couch and magically absorb information. We must design our microlessons to actively encourage the learner to filter relevant incoming information, organize it coherently, and explicitly integrate it with what they already know in their long-term memory. That's the only way a temporary thought becomes a permanent schema.
So the major takeaway here is that when you sit down to build a microlesson, you really need to follow these evidence-based design rules. The multimedia principle says always combine words and pictures. Spatial contiguity means you keep your text right next to the graphic it describes. Please don't make the user's eyes frantically hunt around the screen. The coherence principle demands that you brutally remove unnecessary, distracting elements. Seriously, if it doesn't directly serve the learning goal, cut it out to lower that extraneous load. And the redundancy principle warns us, whatever you do, don't put a massive block of text on the screen and then read it aloud word for word. That forces the visual and auditory channels to process the exact same text simultaneously, which totally overloads the brain. Instead, use visuals on the screen and use your voice to actually explain them.
Our researcher, Nidhi Sachdeva, actually included this brilliant Desmond Tutu quote in her thesis acknowledgments, and honestly, it perfectly captures the ultimate ethos of evidence-based microlearning. There's only one way to eat an elephant, a bite at a time. You simply cannot conquer complex, biologically secondary knowledge all at once. You have to break the elephant down into precise, manageable, properly designed bites. So, I'll leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought for your own instructional designs. When you sit down to create your next short video or slide deck, ask yourself, are you just making something short to check a box and be trendy? Or are you actually using cognitive science to conquer the biological bottleneck of the human brain? I really hope this explainer has sparked a massive desire in you to apply real, evidence-based cognitive architecture to your next project. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into the science of microlearning. Keep learning, one bite at a time.